reproduction ships from the 1700s. We are recording this session, so it will be shown on YouTube. And again, if you're with us tonight, put in the comments where you're at now. And if you're watching this later on our YouTube channel, put in the comments on that so we can see and check back with that. So Laurel has got experience on old vessels as well as new vessels. She's worked as an underwater archaeologist, diving and doing excavations on everything from Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's to Revenge, to Captain Kidd's in the Dominican Republic. So Laurel, we're going to hand it over to you. Thank you for being our presenter tonight, and I look forward to hearing what you have. And if anybody has questions, put them in the chat box, and Yael will be our mediator and monitor those after the presentation is done.
Excellent. So now I get to try to play with technology and see if I can share my screen. And I think Yael's going to need to enable me to be able to share so I can show you some of these pictures of the art that I found.
Should be good to go.
All right, we're good to go. Let's see what I can do here. How about, let's see what that looks like. And is it up on screen? I think it'll.
Yes, you can see it. That's perfect.
Okay, I'll probably have the white borders on either side, but hopefully that's okay.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Yes, technology. Welcome. If you've joined today for this talk, you may have seen two different titles. One of them was the on some of the posters for Immerse Yourself, it said Sailors, Lore, and Superstition. And I was like, well, considering my expertise, we're going to narrow that right down and we'll bring it into Sirens and Pirate Wenches. So at least it's my own area of expertise, women at sea. And of course, you know, that's supposed to lure you in. I'm glad you're here for this glimpse of the world of art and archaeology. If you have any questions, of course, put them in the chat. And let's get started. So with my research expertise being seafaring women mostly in the 19th century, I had a lot of fun with this talk, looking back through the ages and finding even more in the history books. So tonight I'm really focusing more on some of the art that you might find with these and how maritime archaeologists actually use this art to bring our research up to the surface. But even more than that, my real, what would you call, need here is that what I really want to do is to rationally vanquish this long held superstition. So all those, sailors' lore and superstitions that women are bad luck on boats. Because somehow there's this misconception out there that in all of recorded history and in all cultures for all women, that they were always believed to be bad luck at sea. And so they weren't there on the ships, right? But that is just not true. So documented evidence proves that hundreds of women lived aboard ships, even just in the 19th century. And there were even others before that, of course. And I might add that during that 19th century, there are no statistical anomalies that exist of there being more sinkings or less monetary return for the whale oil or the cargo when there was a woman on board. So let's see if we can't squash that superstition once and for all. So that's my goal. And along the way, maybe to entertain you a bit. So for me, this need to share about women at sea really started at an early age. I grew up on a sailboat. My parents moved us on board when I was quite young. And from there, I went on to work on board tall ships. So from learning the ropes, literally, I began working in sail training. I'm the third from the left in that photo that you can see there, and we're about 60 feet up off the deck. So from this fascination with history and the maritime past, I decided to become a maritime archaeologist. So I went from sailing on top of the ocean to looking at what happens on the bottom after some captain has had a really, really bad day. So because much of what happens goes on below the water's surface, maritime archaeology often seems to be a lesser known branch of archaeology, like what are we really doing down there? But there are some really high profile sites that have captured the public's imagination. Perhaps some of you have heard of the Titanic. As a maritime archaeologist, this idea of, what is maritime archaeology, all things related to the sea. But my goal really isn't just to study the artifacts, so beads, the ropes, entire ships for themselves, but it's more for that insight that they give us into the lives of the men and women who were there and using them. So my job is to collect the data, analyze it, form the best interpretation, and then to bring those stories to life. And one of the ways to do that is through art. So the archaeology of shipwrecks will often assume that it was an all-male population on board the ship, which, usually it's correct because the actual ratio of women on board to the thousands of sailors at that time, it's a little big. And often, if anything is found, if it's a feminine item, it's just assumed that it was being taken home as a gift to a sweetheart or a wife waiting back on shore. So these whalebone busks, for corsets like these, they may have been carved by the sailors, but then that idea is, what else can they tell us about the culture aboard ship? So this photo shows, the latest fashion of the era. She would have been wearing those whalebone busks in her corset, but this is a movie set interpretation. They wouldn't have had photos back then, well, maybe some. We do know from the records that this was how they lifted the captain's wife on board the ship. And so this focus not just on the objects, but like, what were the people doing with them? So now, deep rooted in this superstition of women being bad luck on ships is this idea that we might somehow be a distraction for men. And mermaids and sirens are really what embody that power. So across cultures, you'll find them from Southeast Asia, some of these pictures on the left, all the way into Europe. Even Columbus noted sightings of them in his logbook of mermaids, he said, probably manatees, when they reached the New World. This painting shows St. Nicholas saving the mariners who are obviously helpless against the wiles of a mermaid. She's down there on the lower left. Note her little fishtail feet. Both sirens and mermaids perform the same dark magic in legends, singing sailors to their doom, enticing them to smash their ships into the rocks. But doesn't just seem like maybe passing the blame? So let's say the sailors gets rescued after wrecking a ship and someone asks, oh, well, how'd that happen? So if the captain says, oh, he totally didn't see that huge island ahead, he's really going to get laughed at as a bit of an idiot or worse. And so he's quick and he says, oh, yeah, there was this beautiful singing and we were distracted. What, you wrecked because some girl on shore was singing? Oh, no. We were enchanted, yes, and then lured into danger. Yeah, that's it, by these powerful creatures who were half women and half fish or birds, depending on the story. Oh, well, in that case, praise be, you've escaped with your life. We'll have to warn everyone about these evil beasts. So doesn't it just seem like you're not taking responsibility for what happened? So my goal tonight is to present the research that shows how beyond these mythical creatures, there are records of women aboard sailing ships who sailed as pirates, as chieftains, as prostitutes, cross-dressers, and on naval and merchant ships, the officers' families. So to lead you through time and the lives of these women who sailed on board, I'm going to focus on 5 shipwrecks. The BURGUS wreck being the first one was actually 2,400 years ago. El Gran GRIN was a Spanish Armada shipwreck. The royal warship VASA in the 17th century, the Queen Anne's Revenge found off Beaufort, North Carolina, and the schooner Windiate sunk in the Great Lakes in the 19th century. So we'll start with a link to Sirens and Mermaids with a recently discovered ancient Greek ship in the Black Sea that matches the ship on the Siren vase. The famous Siren vase, seen here, dates to 480 BC and shows a confrontation between Odysseus and the Sirens. Luckily, he'd been warned by the goddess Circe to stop up the sailors' ears with wax so that they could not hear the songs, but he wanted to hear them. So he had them tie him to the mast so he could figure out what they were singing. The BURGUS wreck itself, it is a Greek wreck, and it's believed to be the world's oldest intact sunken shipwreck. It was found 50 miles off the coast in Bulgaria, from Bulgaria, and it's in more than 6,000 feet of water. So you can see the remote control vehicle there taking a look at the bottom of the ocean. It's 75 feet long and it's lying there on its side. And it is in such good condition because the water at that depth in the Black Sea is anoxic, free of oxygen. So there's the rudder, there's the rowing benches, and even the contents of its hold are actually intact. So the resemblance to the Siren vase is quite uncanny. You can see like the shape of it and everything. Even the oars look like the crew had actually, just stepped away from them for a moment. Perhaps future investigations will be able to actually look at the cargo aboard or determine maybe why it sank. But this was not the work of Sirens. So far from the shore, there was nothing for them to bump into out there. Perhaps it was storms, but more research would have to be done, and the reason may never be known for why it did sink. So we leave the Sirens in ancient Greece and we head on, jumping through the centuries, to the formal paintings of the 16th century. So this portrait of Queen Elizabeth I celebrates the victory of the British over the Spanish Armada in 1588. El Gran GRIN was one of the Spanish Armada ships to escape the attack by the fire ships, only to then wreck on the Irish coast. And that event is depicted up there on the right top corner of the portrait. So at 1,100 tons burthen, this was a huge ship, and it was one of the largest in the entire Armada. It carried 329 men, and there was 28 guns, only to wreck on the rocks at the southwest tip of Clare Island in Ireland. So according to documents, the English accounts were that most of the crew drowned, but the captain and about 100 of the crew came ashore. So this is where it gets a little blurry. They say they were all captured and held prisoner, but then when they tried to escape, they were all killed. It seems really unlikely because at that time, that island was belonged to Grace O'Malley. So maybe it was just what they decided to tell the nosy British. Grace O'Malley was a chieftain in County Mayo, and as recorded by Sir Henry Sidney in 1577, a most feminine sea captain. So she was also known to have trading ties with Spain, so it's more than likely that the officers from the GRAN were ransomed back to their homeland. This is all speculation, of course. There are no records that exist, or they were all destroyed, that would actually corroborate my guesses. In the 16th century, when England began to impose control over Ireland, O'Malley not only supported the rebellious actions against the governor, Sir Richard Bingham, but she also harried British ships off the Irish coast. So I guess that would probably be called pirating. Her mainland castle at Rockfleet, which is shown here, and there's another she had on Clare Island, were defensible fortresses when needed. When her two sons were captured and imprisoned, O'Malley actually sailed to England to formally petition Queen Elizabeth, which is that engraving that's there on the bottom left. So she petitioned her for their release. She and the Queen eventually came to an agreement. They were conversing in Latin, that the Queen would withdraw Bingham from Ireland and O'Malley would stop supporting these rebellious Irish lords. But the truce didn't really last that long, and O'Malley returned to pirating the English ships. There are a few other women captains that show up in the records. Usually they were widowed and they inherited their position, and occasionally some can be found in other cultures, such as the pirate Xing Shi, and she inherited the beginning of her fleet of ships, but she amassed even more in the South China Seas in the early 1800s. Far later into the 1930s, Soviet women worked as captains in their merchant navy, such as Valentina Orlikova, I'm sure I've totally butchered that, who worked as captain on board their ship. And there was a few others that they have in the records that you really just don't hear about. Even today, there are a few women who captain larger ships, but this is slowly changing. Billie J. Farrell will be the first ever female commanding officer of the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, and is actually scheduled to take command in just 2 days from now on Friday. like this Friday. So we move from these extravagant paintings from the upper class to the sculptures decorating a royal warship of the 17th century. So this ship was built to project this naval might of Sweden and the king, and the VASA set off to join the war effort in 1628. It sank before it even left Stockholm harbor. For its length, it was 226 feet. It just wasn't constructed with enough width for the shape of the hull, but the dimensions had been specifically asked for by the king himself. So for that grand celebration at departure, all of the ports were opened for a salute, but as a gust of wind heeled the ship over, the water quickly flooded in those lowest gun ports, and it quickly sank. Luckily, almost everyone was rescued from the ship. And at the inquiry, no one was found to blame because that head shipwright had recently passed away, so no heads rolled. The woman in the photo there on the left is actually examining the skeletal remains of one of the few crew who did die in that cold Baltic water. The upside is these cold conditions made for absolutely spectacular survival of this ship. Given the right conditions, wood can survive extremely well underwater. And in the Baltic, there are no wood-eating teredo worms. All very stern and grim looking here on the left, but it would have been brightly painted in its day. After decades of conservation, the ship now sits in a fully climate-controlled museum, and so much of it is art itself. It was decorated with more than 700 sculptures and ornaments. 10 years ago, I worked on the project documenting the lower decks of the VASA for a 3D rendering. So this left-hand image that you're seeing here shows a photogrammetry model of the ship. And then the ship model on the right shows all the colors that scholars believe were the originals used. Like they actually picked little bits of paint out of the cracks and found out what they think was painted in certain places. And then there's also an exhibit that shows the replicas of those and how they would have been painted. It really is quite amazing. So from the archaeology that we have some idea of the living conditions for the sailors that were on the ship, pretty much because it was all loaded, ready to go out to join the war effort. Everything that they pulled off the ship was there. Everything was stocked up for the sailors to be on board. But unfortunately, little is known of the women that were aboard VASA. There were 2 women skeletons that were found, besides that one that she was looking at in the other picture. But their individual stories have then been lost to history. So they may have been sailors' wives or a family of officers coming along for the voyage, or they might have been getting off at the first stop where they were loading the cannons, which is at the end of the inlet that Stockholm is on. The remains have had facial reconstruction, like you can see with BURGUS here, to bring them to life at the museum. In general, up until the 19th century, women were often on naval ships. So some that lived aboard throughout the trip, these would be the wives of warrant officers, and they were assigned to that specific ship, such as gunners, bosuns, and carpenters. So they stayed with the same ship the whole time, along with pursers, sailmakers, coopers, and cooks. They all could traditionally bring their wives, depending on the size of the ship. During battles, women nursed the wounded or ran gunpowder along with the cabin boys. And some of them were even awarded pensions when injured in the line of duty. So we have records of them being on these ships. Other women on naval ships only came aboard in every port. So because sailors often suffered these absolutely wretched conditions, there was this lack of shore leave that meant there would be less desertions. So instead, all the prostitutes were loaded onto these small boats and brought out to them on the ships. In some cases, a sailor would choose a wife for the duration of a voyage, and this was usually for a short distance, not these long distance voyages. However, there is a case probably a century later from the VASA, where there were 200 women that were sentenced to transportation to Australia, and they went on a ship called the Lady Juliana, aka the floating brothel. So these were prostitutes, petty thieves, con artists. They were all rounded up from the overcrowded prisons in London and put onto the ship to be taken there. And usually like a trip to down under at that point on these in that era lasted about 5 months, but this slow boat took 11 months and it stopped in every port that it could get into along the way. I believe they stopped in Rio. So really no one was in a hurry to get there. From there, we leave the Baltic, the cold waters where the Vasa sank, and move on to the American coast. The pirate ship Queen Anne's Revenge continues to be well known from modern forms of media such as films, but originally its fame grew from illustrations in pamphlets and books that were published, and these were, to entertain the masses and separate them from their coin. And one of these contemporary sources is the illustrated book, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, written in 1724 by Captain Charles Johnson. They didn't have short titles then. The pirate Edward Teach, aka Blackbeard, who commanded the Queen Anne's Revenge, is probably one of the most notorious of sea robbers in the age of piracy. He captured the Queen Anne's Revenge from the French in the Caribbean, and he made it his flagship because of its speed and its large size at over 100 feet long. So he plundered along the coast with his crew until they grounded the Queen Anne's Revenge on a sandbar outside of Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina, and they had to abandon the ship. There, Blackbeard marooned rather a lot of his 300-man crew and then left with all the valuable loot for himself. So perhaps he was really just downsizing when he crashed the ship. Only a few months later, he was finally defeated by the British Royal Navy, who were hunting him down. This ended his 18-month career. So for the amount of press that he got, it really was a short career that he'd had. For many years, North Carolina state archaeologists have excavated the Queen Anne's Revenge site, and I was a part of several field seasons that brought up artifacts from the wreck, such as this cannon. The retrieved artifacts are currently in a lab undergoing preservation and analysis. So from any archaeological investigation, a site plan like this one is created to answer research questions, along with the research that they're doing on the artifacts themselves. And in this case, what they were answering questions on was life aboard ships in the early 18th century. One of the recent finds actually came from the wadding that was inside a loaded cannon. So when the conservators were carefully separating all of these sections, they found small scraps of paper. After much research, one was finally identified. It is a fragment from a 1712 first edition of a book by Captain Edward Cook called A Voyage to the South Sea and Around the World. So you see, even pirates read adventure tales. Oop, hit that twice, but there you go. Of the women who cross-dressed to pass as men on ships, we only know of those who were caught. These included Hannah Snell and Mary Lacy, who joined the British Navy, and Jean Barret, who joined the French expedition going to the South Seas. And of course, the infamous pirate women here from Charles Johnson's General History on Pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So at her mother's urging, Mary Read began cross-dressing at a very early age, according to the history. She was pretending to be a boy in order to illegally collect an inheritance. And then later on, she continued and actually joined the military. She met up with Anne Bonny and Jack Rackham in the West Indies and joined their crew. And Anne at that point was also hiding her gender while aboard ship. According to the tales, they eventually discovered each other's disguises. And soon afterwards, in 1720, when they were all captured, the women might also have hung with their crew if they hadn't pleated their bellies that they were pregnant. So although many of their exploits have obviously been exaggerated in these tales, the records do exist of their convictions as pirates in the archives at the Jamaican courts. And as tried as I have, as much as I could, to track down this ship that they sailed with Jack Rackham, and the Ranger, unfortunately, is a very common name. In the sunken city of Port Royal, Jamaica, an archaeological team excavated a ship in the ruins called the Ranger, but it doesn't match the description of Bonnie and Reed's ship. Instead, it's actually thought to be the Ranger that pirate Black Bart commanded. But unfortunately, that means there's really nothing yet known in the archaeological record of women aboard pirate ships. So moving from those warm waters in the Caribbean, we head again up north to the chill of the Great Lakes, which, similar to the Baltic, has some absolutely fantastic preservation of shipwrecks. So as you can see in this model, the Windiate, it is a 139-foot schooner, and those clear waters and the conditions that they have up there in the Great Lakes also allow for producing these amazing 3D images of underwater sites that really can help bring this research from maritime archaeology to the surface. The Cornelia B. Windiate disappeared in a late November storm in 1875. It was lost with all hands. It was built only the year before. And unfortunately, it went out overloaded with wheat bushels and then vanished, possibly succumbing to layers of ice when a storm rolled in. It was found by divers in 1986, so far later. It was found in Lake Huron, and it sits in 185 feet of water, exactly upright on the bottom. So there are many ways to present an underwater archaeological site. Often the first of these, and possibly the lowest budget option, is this 2D site map showing the ship's features. These are usually designed with divers in mind to assist their visit to the wreck. This one actually shows the yawl boat tucked in on the starboard quarter, as if maybe the crew were just attempting to leave and save themselves. Another way to present a wreck would be a 3D style image to show the wreck site itself. And another way, let's see if I can make this work, would be an animated view. So this way the wreck can be shown in a 3D as like a flyover of the site. And you'll note they've also added in the educational labels. And there is that yawl boat again on the starboard side. Finally, the image that I first showed you, the technology now exists to do three-dimensional rendering and photogrammetry, just taking all those pictures and having programs that will actually collate and compress all of this information to create the 3D image. This one in particular of the Windiate was created by Becky Schott, and you can check it out. The completed model is on Sketchfab. And you can see the wreck almost live, except you're not in that frozen water up in the lakes, which in the summer, I think, still will be in the 30s Fahrenheit. So many merchant and whaling vessels sailed with the wives and families of the officers. So on these larger blue water ships, they may also have hired maids on to help with the women and passengers and the children. There was even records of nursemaids that came along on ships. On a whaling ship, however, the wife of the captain often sailed as the only woman on board, and sometimes if she bore a child, then that child would be there with her too. So much of my research has been in the archives and museums, reading 19th century women's journals and letters. And what you can see over there on the left, that cross-hatched writing on the same piece of paper is really no fun to try to read. And then I'm looking through the entire sets of these writings and letters to find the artifacts that women would have used on the ship. So although not definitive proof of a woman aboard any particular shipwreck, finding certain objects on an archaeological site might hint at their presence aboard. In the late 19th century, Mattie Nichols, seen here in this woodcut, lived aboard the bark Clara and then the ship Frank Pendleton. So the woodcut was actually published in their family newsletter that they printed and mailed out to their friends. So she's shown here at her sewing machine, a very feminine object. She was one of the career captain's wives. She sailed with her husband for 14 years. She circumnavigated the globe 4 times, and she bore 2 of their 3 daughters on board the ship. So finding artifacts that are also related to children, such as toys like this, would also be some of the best proof to indicate that women were on board the ship. Children were really not likely to be sailing there without their mother. Again, although women were left out of most of the official records, occasionally these wives of officers are more noticeable in contemporary accounts when they are actually keeping the official logbooks and doing the navigation. Especially with shorthanded crews in the late 19th century, the captain often taught his wife and daughter how to navigate, just as a safety measure, just in case. Eleanor Crees, however, was an expert in navigation. She had learned from her father on their ship. They were a ship sailing family. And when she married, her husband was the captain on the clipper ship Flying Cloud, and she did all the navigation. They set a record time from New York to San Francisco because of her navigation. They did it in 89 days and 8 hours, and that is a record that stood for over 130 years. Other seafaring women were not so lucky, and they ended up that they had to take command because their husbands fell ill or died. One of the more famous cases was Mary Ann Patton, who took command of a clipper ship for over 50 days, bringing the ship around Cape Horn and into San Francisco while she was also nursing her husband. Lucky him. So now back to my real purpose for this talk, which is to dispel that ridiculous superstition that has been passed down in our maritime traditions for far too long. This fallacy of women as bad luck. It really became sort of a self-fulfilling belief that no women actually ever went to sea because they can't have been allowed on board. And therefore, the presence of women just seemed to be ignored in maritime research and written out of the histories completely, like somehow even mentioning them might cause bad luck. And this continues in a cycle because they aren't in the official history books. Women must have stayed off the ships because they were really bad luck. Wow. However, as you've just heard, many women have been on ships throughout history, and were more likely some good luck in there on those ships. So let's dump that superstition into the drink where it belongs. So just to wrap it all up, you've been inundated with info and images on women at sea, beyond the lore and superstition of sirens and mermaids. And perhaps you've gained some understanding of the different circumstances that brought women aboard those ships, from pirate wenches to the prostitutes in port, from captains' wives to cross-dressers that joined the crew. Of course, if you're interested in more, anything that's maritime, a few years back, I co-founded the nonprofit we call CMAP, because it's a lot shorter than saying Seafaring Education and Maritime Archaeological Heritage Programs. We run field schools with experiential learning, incorporating ship sailing, boat building, with the archaeology of local sites. Most of the ones we have done have been in Massachusetts. As you can see here, the tide is out in this drone shot, and we have been researching a beach wreck of the steamship City of Rockland. We did not get to it last season due to the current circumstances, but we hope to be expanding further maritime archaeology courses, hopefully underwater in Florida, and even workshops online this year. If you want more information, once the pandemic passes, feel free to join us, resuming that hands-on training in courses that we do, or keep an eye out for online offerings. There's always volunteering with agencies who are protecting archaeological sites, such as NOAA in the Florida Keys has at the National Marine Sanctuary, or Florida Public Archaeology Network, that's that FPAN there. They do training for citizen science. And if you aren't going to get in diving, there are always citizen science programs that focus on beach wrecks, and you can find out about them by contacting a local archaeological society. I will be continuing to share my research on women at sea and maritime archaeology, giving talks such as these. And of course, if there's any of these that you need more information on, please let me know. So hopefully this talk is giving you some insight into women at sea and maritime archaeology, along with the art that portrays that world. I really want to thank the History of Diving Museum once again for hosting me and for all of you joining us. If you have any questions, now is the time. Thank you so much. I suppose I will need to take my screen off of there. Aha. I think that worked.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laurel, so much. I'm sure there are a lot of questions in the chat, and so I'll be kind of moderating. If you want to put yours in, I'll group ones together that make sense together. But the first questions that's in the chat is, what was the name of the brothel ship that was headed to Australia? And is there a resource that you can recommend where people can learn more about that?
Absolutely, it is. The book itself is called The Floating Brothel. The ship's name was the Lady Juliana. I think I have that right, the Lady Juliana. I can't remember the dates for it, but yes, Sean Rees is the author, R-E-E-S, and just look for the title, The Floating Brothel.
Cool, thank you. And so is there any records of what people back then actually believed in terms of the superstitions? Did they believe in them, or were they kind of like, oh no, these captains are passing the blame even back then?
Oh yeah, they believe them. There's actually stories of one of those. Remember, so part of what I was saying, that like if there was a shorter distance, everybody would choose a sailor's wife, and they would take the women with them from one short distance to the next. There was a case where they left with 60 women on the boat, and they got out there and there was a huge storm, and they were like, oh my gosh, the women must be bad luck. And they threw 60 women into the ocean off the ship. Guess what? The entire ship still crashed and was destroyed, and pretty much everybody died that was on it. So yes, they definitely believed that women were bad luck. And on occasion, they were proved completely wrong, that wasn't what was going on.
So has the Burgess wreck been mapped using photogrammetry as well? And if so, do you know who did it, when it was done, kind of any of the details of that?
I might need somebody's email to that to get back to you on it. The wreck itself in the Black Sea was a project called the Black Sea Project, I believe. It can be found online. If they've done a photogrammetry model, I don't think I've seen it. It's an absolutely awesome project. I believe it's from 2 years ago. Don't quote me on that. So it is easy to find online. Look up Black Sea underwater archaeology, the Burgess wreck. The oldest wreck intact. Yeah, there's all those caveats, right? The oldest intact sunken shipwreck. Yeah, it's a very cool wreck.
And Anne is asking, do you see any crossover between the witch trials and women being considered bad luck?
I don't. There might be research out there on that. It was just for such different reasons from what I was reading for sirens and mermaids and women on ships. It would definitely be something that would be interesting to see if that same era correlated with any like higher intensity, like those 60 women that got thrown off that naval ship. I'm not sure.
So there's a few other questions, but I also have a question, like my own question that I'm going to throw in there. And it's, do you see a difference in the way that superstitions are talked about, whether the ship were like naval ships or pirate ships? Because I think a lot of kind of stories about pirates is that their society might have been different a little bit than other seafaring societies or rules or norms. And so I'm wondering if you've seen a distinction there in terms of any of the superstitions of what kind of women were on the ship for what reasons.
Were the superstitions different? There are not a lot of written records from pirate ships, so that makes it very difficult. There is one that I know of that is actually Edward Teach's supposed logbook from a ship. Unfortunately, I have not read it. But as far as if they were looked at differently because it was a pirate ship versus a regular naval ship or a merchant ship, one of the big things that I noticed was if there were women on the ship, if it was a class structure basis, like a lot of the merchant ships, if there was the captain's wife and passengers, the crew didn't even pay attention to them. So if you find journals that are from the crew, the lowly sailors who could actually write, very, very seldom do they even say anything about, the passengers that were women or the captain's wife. Like there's just this huge divide. And so there isn't this, oh, they're bad luck on the ship. There was one whaling wife, so on a whaling ship, who it had gotten to the end of the time when whales were easy to be found, and they were going, years and years out at sea to try to find whales, and they were having a run of bad luck, and she was on the ship. And I think maybe she was a little bit worried because she does actually mention in the journal, like, perhaps it's time for me to go home, and it seems like we're not catching any whales. Just trying to think for like different sources. For the Navy, yeah, that one incident of so many of them being thrown off. For the women who did cross-dress to then join in with the Navy, the British Navy, the ones that were found out, or the ones who wrote their own story later, it's not even so much that they worry about those particular women who had cross-dressed being bad luck. It was more that they wanted to know that they had gone back to the proper way for things to be, and that they'd returned to being a normal woman, and that this was just a passing thing, that they had joined the Navy, and then perhaps they'd been chasing their true love, but then all had gone back to the way it was supposed to be. So that was more of the story that they wanted to show than the oh my gosh, they've been bad luck, and that Navy ship did nothing right during that time. There's another book that's really good for the research itself is from Suzanne Stark, who talks about female tars and has a lot more to say about naval vessels. So I think part of them being written out of history was so many of those naval vessels far earlier than when it was like decided that, oh no, we can't have any more of these women on ships, they're a distraction. At that point, like the warrant officers, they always brought their wives. It was just tradition. They didn't leave port without them, kind of thing. So sorry, that was kind of a big question.
No, it was a good answer.
I'm not sure it answered it, but like there's all those different ways that they might have been considered bad luck, or were they bad luck?
Yeah. So this one is a more personal question, just about your own experiences and expertise of what's an interesting experience that you've had diving, or maybe one of the most interesting, or one that you want to share with us.
Sure. For diving, I have to say that when you're a maritime archaeologist and you're, down in this marine world, so often you're working and you're creating clouds of dirt because you're digging through sand, or you're digging through something to try to find things, and there isn't a lot of visibility. So if you do actually go for a dive that is just for fun, all of a sudden you can see everything and the water's clear. Some of the best diving experiences that immediately come to mind was we went and did a project on what's believed to be Captain Kidd's last prize. So he captured it off of the Dominican Republic. It's really shallow water, so it's not like a scary dive. It was, more that we needed to make sure we had all that extra air to do the work that we were doing, but the water was clear. So it was just like super exciting to go from working where you can almost never see anything. So as far as, interesting diving experience, it was mostly that I can see the wreck. I can see all the cannons. This is great. It's funny what gets you excited, isn't it?
Yeah, it's different when you have different experiences diving, of like what you're used to, and then when it's out of the norm, that's what gets exciting.
Right.
So besides from the women on the ships themselves, has there been any evidence of women taking action to rebuke the superstition, writing pamphlets or any kind of thing like that?
Not that I found. That doesn't mean they're not out there. Well, other than myself trying to turn things around, I spread other rumors, that's not the truth. I think part of it is just how it's read, and the further away we get in history from these old sailing ships, I feel like the women were there and not all of them were considered bad luck, but because of the way histories are written more recently, they just aren't included. And because they aren't in the official records, it's really hard to calculate. Like, yeah, statistical anomalies, the few that I calculated, it's really hard to tell. Yeah, I can't think of anything, like, it would be great to think that they were down there on the docks marching with signs going, "It's not fair, we're not bad luck," but I don't think that happened. To write the pamphlet myself, right? Sorry, go ahead.
You could, produce a historical artifact and backdate it somehow.
Right.
Is there any research about Black women on ships?
Absolutely. I saw an excellent talk recently looking at part of it was agency. Most of it was steamships. So they were hired on to a lot of the steamships or hired out. So if they were slaves, hired out to steamships. And part of that was the autonomy that they had to be out there on their own, making money even for themselves, that not all of it had to go back to their owners in that era. I would have to look up the name of the article that she then had written from that. If somebody needs me to get back to them, I would need an email from them so I could tell them about it. But yes, there is research that has been done more on the history side of things than in the archaeology. Most of what's known from the archaeology side of things is slave ships that have been identified, some of which are in the Keys. And the one, of course, that I know is that the Queen Anne's Revenge actually started out as a slave ship. Thank you. I will need to write that down, find a pen. Or yeah,
I can copy it and email it to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I have another question, kind of, when you mentioned Queen Anne's Revenge being a slave ship, when I think about seafaring in the 18th century, I think a lot about the transatlantic slave trade. And I'm wondering if there are any impacts that had on some of the superstitions, or how people reconciled those things, because there were tons of women who were being taken from Africa on those ships. But people wanted them on those ships because, they were being monetized. And I'm just wondering if there's any record of how those two things kind of played into each other, of the superstitions and what was going on.
I'm trying to think if there was any records that I've seen on that in my research. This talk is definitely more difficult because it's sort of borderlines on a lot of my research, whereas specifically my research is more 19th century. It's not to say that slave trade continued in through that. So for what was superstition wise, whether they thought that there was, I can't think of anything that I've read. Sorry, Yell.
But I think that's what also you were saying in your talk a little bit, is that there are all of these historical silences about women on board, and there's also tons of historical silences about the experience of enslaved people on ships.
Exactly.
So silences are hard to fill because they were intentionally created in some way or another because people didn't think it was important. So I think it makes sense that some of these questions are harder to answer, because that's the whole point, is that there are these silences.
They've disappeared in the records. Yeah, and so part of that was one of the ones that avenues that I was trying to follow doing my own research was finding the hired help, finding the people who were on this ship who weren't necessarily and writing it, if they were writing at all, writing in a language that I would have found. They would be in archives elsewhere, other countries. But there were so many women that were hired on as nursemaids or were hired on as help that not only are they not in the records, like the only thing that we know of them is usually if someone was annoyed with them, if somebody was mad at them. So the, you know, the captain's wife would be writing, you know, like, oh, she's so horrible, she can't do anything right. And we're going to put her off in the next port. And you're like, where the heck are you dropping this poor Chinese woman that you've picked up in, you know, Shanghai, and now you're in France or something. So, you know, hopefully she found a job to get her home. Like, it just seemed just a little insensitive. Yeah, no, it really hard to find in the written records, but you know, they're there. Other questions? There was something back there about Bonaire. I think I saw it slide by.
Yeah, someone was asking about the reports of sirens that lured ships to wreck off the coast of Bonaire specifically.
I also wonder sometimes if, I haven't heard specifically about the ones in Bonaire, but that idea of things that were set up to lure ships in general in order to wreck them in certain areas, because then they were easy pickings, moving lights that were on shore that, you know, people think they know where the light is at a certain spot. So those ships would have been purposely wrecked. I have not heard about the ones in Bonaire, but that sounds like it would be fun to look into some more.
And we have maybe time for one more. So can you talk about any records of women as privateers or pirates? I think you mentioned a few in your talk, but.
Oh, privateers versus pirates, one that were actually sanctioned by the king. So other than Grace O'Malley, who was definitely more privateer because she pretty much only attacked British ships that went by because she was annoyed that they were trying to what would you call that, exert power within Ireland over her area. Eventually they came into Mayo County. Again, not specifically women pirates and privateers wise, other than her, but it was definitely a thing that at a point where so Captain Kidd's ship, some of the information when he went to court to prove that he really was a privateer and not a pirate, some of that information when they got to court was missing because they were making an example of him, and so he was hung. So yeah, it does happen. Like the people who get labeled as pirates, it's more just that they've attacked one specific country and that country would label them pirates. Sir Francis Drake was a pirate to the Spanish. I wish I could think of a specific example for women, but there's so few women out there. I'm pretty sure Xing-Chi, the Chinese pirate of the early 1800s, I don't think she was sanctioned. I think she just took on any ship that her fleet could.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa again for our last goodbyes. But again, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Laurel for giving this great talk and making us think about all of these kind of gaps in our knowledge about women at sea. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa for the final goodbye, and we're going to mention our Immerse Yourself presentation for next month.
Yes. Laurel, thank you very much. We always learn something new when you talk about women in the sea, and I appreciate you going beyond your normal comfort level and doing some extra research to include it so that it kind of complements our fantasy and, you know, the whole theme of our featured exhibit, because it's an unknown area. So we appreciate your expertise and then some. And as a thank you, the History of Diving Museum is extending a 1-year membership for Laurel, so you can come down 362 days and visit when we are open daily. I know that you're currently up north, but when you're down in the Keys, come on down and see our featured exhibit. We're gonna, after fantasy is over, we're gonna be having sponge hunters from May to December through the end of the year. And again, thank you for our sponsors this month, Liz Bonus and Culture Builds Florida. We appreciate what you do as a support of the museum. And as Yael had mentioned, for next month, we are going to have Kamal Sadisky, who is with the, he's the lead instructor for and board member for Diving with a Purpose, and the immediate past president for National Association of Black Scuba Divers, also known as NABS. They go around and they survey, try to get some information on potential slave ships and the various projects around the world that Diving with a Purpose is working on. So we're real excited about having him continue the marine archaeology kind of theme for another month. So thank you everybody for joining us. We greatly appreciate all that you do to support the museum, and invite you that if you want to become a sponsor for one of these talks, to reach out to director@divingmuseum.org. So have a wonderful Wednesday evening, and we'll see you in February.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.